World leaders, entrepreneurs and activists are in the Swiss Alps discussing the global economy, the impact of the China-US trade deal and climate change. We'll bring you the highlights from the World Economic Forum. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. US President Donald Trump held a news conference in Davos on Wednesday before flying back to the United States. The US president praised the strength of the US economy, called for reforms within the World Trade Organization, and said he hoped to engage soon in trade talks with the European Union after reaching trade deals with China, Japan, Mexico, and Canada. For the latest, we turn now to CGTN's Guy Henderson in Davos. And Guy, the US president says he's turning his attention to Europe for trade talks. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of people here, and who were wondering whether Donald Trump might just look to at least threaten to drop another trade bomb during this year's Davos. It didn't come during his main speech to the Congress here on Monday. It has come now at a press conference just before his departure. The Phase 1 trade deal between the United States and China has been signed off. It appears as though Donald Trump is setting the stage to potentially make Europe his next target. During that press conference, he spoke about how the EU was, in his view, a place with tariffs all over the place. He says he wants to get those down to zero as a result of pretty rapid trade talks. He's talking about getting this whole thing wrapped up by November, before the election. That means that there will be negotiations potentially right in the midst of an election campaign.
We met with the world leaders, various world leaders, including the president of the European Commission, who we're going to start negotiating a trade deal with, because the European Commission was, frankly, in many ways tougher than China. I say that respectfully, but that's the way it is. They've taken advantage for a long time, and so we're going to have a deal. I suspect we're going to be able to make a deal. Otherwise, we'll have to do something else.
So what is that something else? Well, trade tariffs, very likely indeed. Back in October last year, the United States had already imposed $7.5 billion worth of tariffs on European goods coming into the United States. The EU position is, we'll talk if you start dropping the tariffs. The US position remains, if you don't start talking, we might look to raise those tariffs. And there was even a suggestion during that press conference that Donald Trump had a deadline in mind, a pretty tight deadline, he seemed to suggest, after which he might look to intensify those tariffs if the Europeans don't fold, if you like. Part of the reason the EU is very reluctant to start talking before those tariffs are dropped is that it is desperate to avoid a situation where it becomes normalized for these trade tariffs to be used as a sort of normal tool as part of trade negotiations. They see that as a threat to the global trading system. Donald Trump appears to view them as a tool that, to, at least he claims, defend the global trading system. But I think a lot of people here in Davos suspect is actually a tool to try and defend a narrower set of United States interests, America first.
Guy, let's look at another one of the big international issues. That's climate change. It's been a big theme at Davos, with the teen activist Greta Thunberg telling leaders they've failed planet Earth. How was her message received?
Yeah, I mean, you know, she's a teenage climate activist, a sort of reasonably untouchable symbol, if you like. Even Donald Trump appears to be reluctant to criticize her directly. He was asked directly, is Greta right, just as he was approaching his speech on Monday, and his response was to say, oh, I love the environment, you know, it's very important to me, even if he did go on in the speech himself to talk about, or sort of strongly criticizing some of the people that are leading the fight to try and contain the effects of climate change, talking about them as socialists, pessimists, radicals who are trying to control every aspect of our life, is how he branded them during his speech. And of course, then going on to say that America should be proud of the fact that it's continuing to tap its huge reserves of fossil fuel. So that's Donald Trump's sort of reaction, contrasting, of course, to Greta Thunberg's. But more generally at WF, this year's Davos, climate change is right at the top of the agenda. The organisers here are trying to make sure that a lot of the big companies here leave here with a commitment to climate neutrality by 2050. That is different, though, to what Greta has been calling for here. She is saying we don't want neutrality, we want to stop the use of fossil fuels entirely. And that is not something we are hearing as much from business and political leaders here in Davos.
Thanks, Guy. That's CGTN's Guy Henderson reporting from Davos. For more on the World Economic Forum, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He's a political and economic affairs commentator. From Davos, Philippe Monnier is an international business executive. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Paul Bledsoe. He's the president of Bledsoe and Associates and served as a climate advisor to U.S. President Bill Clinton. And from Portland, Oregon, Antony Chen is the former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Philippe Monnier, let's start with you. You are there in Davos. The Chinese Vice Premier Han Zheng, he addressed this high-level conference in Davos and talked about China's recent trade agreement with the United States, phase one of that trade agreement. This is part of what he had to say. Let's listen.
Last week, China and the United States signed the phase one trade agreement. I think that is known to all. The phase one trade agreement between China and the U.S., good for China, good for the U.S., and good for the world. China will purchase more U.S. products on the basis of WTO rules, market terms, and commercial principles.
So, Philippe, did you get the sense in Davos that there is relief that this deal has been signed, at least phase one of it, and that tensions, trade tensions, have now been lowered somewhat?
I would say it is a first step. It is a positive first step, but a lot of things remain to be done. And then if I look overall at the trade war, I would say that the effect is still negative. It is negative for the consumer in the USA, in China. It is negative for business. I would say it is positive mostly for Mr. Trump, who is, as we all know, facing a new re-election. So I would say there is a partial relief here.
Einar Tangen, one of the other issues that was raised in Davos was the WTO. President Trump talked about reform of the WTO. In fact, all sides agree that there needs to be reform of the World Trade Organization. But President Trump also sees the WTO and its functions very differently. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The World Trade Organization's been very unfair to the United States for many, many years. And without it, China wouldn't be China. China wouldn't be where they are right now. I mean, China, that was the vehicle that they used. And I give them great credit. And I also don't give the people that were in my position great credit because, frankly, they let that all happen. But the vehicle was the World Trade Organization.
So I know Trump also disputes the designation of China and India as developing nations. How big an issue is this?
Well, it's actually very large. I mean, China is still citing WTO, as you said earlier, as the basis for, this kind of framework of international trade. Donald Trump wants, obviously, to dump it. It's kind of like climate change. He talks about, yes, I love it, but in actuality, he's the impediment. He's not going to allow it to come back because they're not. They basically made it toothless because they will not allow any more judges to be appointed. These are the appellate ones, the ones who would decide important matters. So you're hearing a lot of verbiage from Trump, but yes, he is hostile to it.
Let's bring in Antony Chen from Portland, Oregon. Antony, there were several delegates at Davos who pointed out that there's some contradictory signals coming out of the United States. There was David Rubenstein of the Carlyle Group, very big company here in the United States. He pointed out that the U.S. economy is actually doing very well, but at the same time, on the political side, we have the Democrats in Congress putting the president on trial. International business, according to Rubenstein, says they find this very confusing. At the same time, we have the U.S. labor market, which is almost at full employment. Unemployment's running at about 3.5%. But there's also a warning that there could be a slowdown in the economy, in the world economy in 2020. In fact, 53% of CEOs now say that they fear that there could be a slowdown this year. How does one explain all of this?
Well, I think that the U.S. economy is now in the longest running stage of its economic expansion that we've ever seen in U.S. history. And research that I've done finds that as economic expansions mature, guess what happens? They slow down. And so we go from a period of 2.9% growth in the U.S. of real GDP 2 years ago. Last year, probably something around 2.3%. And I'm forecasting that this year will probably grow a little bit less than 2%. That's perfectly normal. Yes, we are at full employment. We have the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. And yes, the economy is doing relatively well, but it is slowing down, as you would expect in an economic expansion.
Antony, as you point out, if growth is only going to get up to 2%, so what kind of impact will that have on the world economy?
I think that for the world economy, we're going to see that world economic growth will have some sort of dampening effects. The good news is that the International Monetary Fund still looks for world economic growth to be a little bit stronger in 2020 and even 2021. Even with the downward revisions that were released the last couple of days, the numbers are still strong enough to suggest that we are very far away from experiencing anything resembling a global recession. Obviously, the IMF suggested that the reductions in world real GDP were mostly because of the reductions in growth that they expect from India. But even saying that, we can't expect growth to be all that robust with all these trade tensions that are serving as a negative headwind for the world economy. Again, the good news is that the U.S. economy is still out of a recession and not likely to be one in 2020. And by the way, the reduction in trade tensions will probably boost economic growth in China, since they were hurt a little bit more than the United States. And so I was impressed when I saw the upward revision in real GDP growth for China estimated by the IMF.
Paul, let's talk about climate change. That, by most accounts, is the signal challenge that the world faces right now. This was the Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg in Davos. Let's listen to what she said.
I wonder, what will you tell your children was the reason to fail and leave them facing a climate chaos that you knowingly brought upon them? That it seemed so bad for the economy that we decided to resign the idea of securing future living conditions without even trying? Our house is still on fire. Your inaction is fueling the flames by the hour. And we are telling you to act as if you loved your children above all else.
So, she said it there, our house is still on fire. Very stirring words there from Greta Thunberg. But President Trump again dismissed people like Greta Thunberg, saying that they are prophets of doom, and said that America would defend its economy. He's seeing it very closely related to the growth of the U.S. economy. Was this another missed opportunity?
I think that the fact that the Davos conference, the main issue is climate change, is a recognition by global corporate leaders that this is the single biggest threat to their own operations, their customers, and long-term market and governmental stability. So you see companies like BlackRock and others in the financial sector making large commitments about their own investments. You see companies in the tech industry like Microsoft going 100% clean energy, but that's not enough. These companies have to directly lobby governments to put in place the measures that are actually going to address this problem. Their own operations are important, but they're not nearly enough. I don't think that corporate leaders quite recognize how bad this is going to get. The events in Australia are indicative of what is going to happen around the globe. Destabilization of economies, reduction in GDP, as Sir Nicholas Stern has indicated in a whole series of reports. These are going to affect the world economy and major corporations, their employees and their customers. This is an economic and public safety and national security issue at its heart. And I think corporate leaders have to begin to lobby governments directly to act.
There was some good news, Paul. The Chinese are promoting an effort to plant or conserve up to 1 trillion trees. And in that respect, President Trump said, we're on board. We're going to join that effort. Is there a need to be a little bit optimistic about that?
It's interesting. We're at a period of very bad news and potentially very good news. The very bad news is the effects of climate change are beginning to manifest all around the world. I co-wrote an essay in the New York Times from the Madrid negotiations with leading climate expert Durwood Zelke that pointed out that the summer sea ice in the Arctic may disappear altogether in as little as 15 years unless we act. To put that in perspective, if that summer sea ice disappears, that would add 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in heat equivalent that we've ever emitted. We are on the precipice of disaster. I think that's the urgency of action is not yet communicated adequately. The good news is we're starting to recognize how we can solve it. The price of renewable energy like wind and solar has fallen 90% in just 10 years. Our ability to reforest the planet is obviously something we need to do.
Right.
So we have the tools necessary, but business has to lobby government directly to use them to act in time. Because if we wait another 20 years as we have the last 20 years, we are going to have problems that will undermine the global economy.
Philippe Monnier, the theme of this year's conference in Davos was sustainability. I mean, there were loads of CEOs, business leaders at this conference in Davos. What did you hear? I mean, we hear, as Paul just mentioned to us, some efforts being made by Microsoft. They want to go 100% non-carbon. We hear about efforts being made by BlackRock. Goldman Sachs say they won't invest in companies who are exploring for Arctic oil right now. But what did you hear there?
Do you know, I think that there are about 1,000 companies or more. On probably every company is making effort and is talking about it. You can attend a lot of corporate presentation, including a side event. And basically, there is only one topic: is how to participate to the effort to have a better world. I think it is a very major effort from business, from government, and from many other parties.
Einar Tangen, China has a very high-level delegation in Davos this year. It's led by Vice Premier Han Zheng. How important is a forum like Davos for China, and what is the central message that Beijing wants the world to hear?
Well, Beijing is very, very close to Davos. I mean, they have the summer Davos here, in Tianjin. That's been a very important thing. But for China, it's really been a vehicle for, talking about what China is doing and trying to attract foreign direct investment, which was up 6.6% this year. This is a very good way to do it. But it's kind of a mismatch in a way. I mean, you have a communist government that has, a market. They're trying to drive the markets and things like this. But this is a group of, 100 billionaires who are kind of looking around, kind of a talk shop sometimes. I agree there has to be more systemic action. But for Beijing, it's just a window into another world. They pay a lot of attention to it, but it's mostly for economic investment.
Antony, we did hear some predictions in Davos that this year we could see slow but sluggish economic growth. There was one very sobering comment, though, that came from the managing director of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva. She warned that record or near record levels of inequality, especially in the United States and in the United Kingdom, feels a lot like the 1920s, and it could ultimately lead to financial disaster. Does she have a point?
Well, I think that there is no question that when you look at many economies, including the United States, what we have seen in recent years is inequality has become a much more serious issue. And you might say, why is that happening? It's pretty obvious, and that is we've had all this quantitative easing, which has lowered interest rates, and lower interest rates increase the value of financial assets. And we know that people at the upper echelons of society own more financial assets than people at the lower rungs of society. So guess what happens? You will see that over time, if you continue to keep interest rates at very low levels, wealth inequality becomes worse. The good news is that as the economies get stronger and unemployment rates come down, that ameliorates that to some extent, but it's still very difficult to basically offset the impact of growing inequality with financial assets growing much, much faster than the U.S. economy. Last year, for example, real GDP is estimated in the United States to have grown about 2.3%. And of course, the stock market, after you include dividends for the S&P 500, is growing by over 30%. So clearly, the financial assets are growing much faster than the overall economy. And Main Street America has much of their wealth tied to the overall real GDP numbers and less to the financial markets, which are certainly growing in excess of 20% faster than the overall economy. So it really should come as no surprise to anyone that inequality has become more of a serious issue. Again, the silver lining is that wages are starting to pick up, but still not enough to completely offset the pressures of the growing wealth inequality that we have.
Right. We also heard some arguments out of Davos on the quality of jobs that are coming onto the market. We didn't hear much about taxation. We still hear a lot about philanthropy, but not taxation.
Well, you got to also realize that as you get tighter and tighter labor markets, you're basically going to be attracting people that were outside the labor market. And those individuals will be going to jobs where maybe they're going to receive some training, but they're not going to get the super high paying jobs because they simply don't have the skills. So this is a process that takes a long time. You need a lot of retraining. You need more education. All those things take time. So you're not going to take people outside the labor force and bring them into these jobs that miraculously overnight are going to be paying much higher wages. So it's a long process out there, but the hope and expectation is that as productivity increases, if we start to see capital spending, which, by the way, in the last 12 to 18 months has been very weak, unless you get stronger productivity, you're not going to see higher standard of living, which will be associated with higher wages and make those jobs giving you payments that are the same that you would expect from higher quality jobs.
Paul, let's get back to our planet and the efforts to save it. There was some alarming news that came out of the Davos conference, and that was there was a report that said that plastics production will double in the next 20 years. Again, it's the fossil fuel companies behind this surge. Now, there are many countries. China is leading an effort to phase out single-use plastics. But if it doubles in the next 20 years, what impact is this going to have?
Again, we have technologies. We can use bio-based packaging and other materials to replace
Why aren't
most
they being
of that.
used now?
Because right now they're cheaper because there's no price on carbon.
Plastic's cheaper.
Yeah, plastic is cheaper than bio-based packaging products, but we can replace them. You know, we have to recognize when you talk about inequality that the global inequality is going to be hugely exacerbated by climate change. It is the poorest who are going to bear the brunt of climate change disasters. In fact, they already are all around the planet. It's happening not just in the developing world, but in the developed world as well. So this has the potential to destabilize governments. When you see things like agricultural production begin to be affected, think of countries like India. The other thing to note is that long-term GDP will drop. Every major study finds that the resource stress in water, on agriculture, on outdoor labor production will actually hurt GDP in the long run. This is an economic issue whose solutions are much cheaper than its costs, and it's time we recognize that. I think China deserves credit, for example, for moving to fully implement a carbon price later this year. I think the United States needs to follow suit, but it's going to take corporate actors to do that. And if it means that some corporations are going to have to work harder on lobbying the oil lobby and other fossil fuel companies, that has to happen because the long-term economic consequences of climate change, no one is quite ready to deal with, but they are very stark.
Philippe Monnier, there were some predictions that after President Trump signs this phase one deal with China, he would turn his sights on Europe. And guess what? He has turned his sights on Europe. In fact, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, has announced a temporary suspension of those taxes that Europe wants to impose on U.S. technology companies. And the United States says for now, it will not impose retaliatory tariffs on imports of European products or French products into the United States. Where do you think this dispute's going? You think it's going to be resolved soon?
You know, I think that Mr. Trump is very good at negotiating, and he's already started to threaten European. And I think that the taxation of the GAFA will be one of the issues. It's not exactly trade, but it has a relation with trade. I would say that Mr. Trump can act very strongly, very fast. He can be seen as a winner, which is very good to be reelected. I'm not so sure that the overall result is very good for his economy and the economy of the world.
Einar Tangen, as we heard, there was much uncertainty among business leaders because of the US-China trade dispute. But now that phase one has been signed, do you think business is now ready to make those big investments in capital expenditure, in more hiring? There didn't seem to be much confidence among business leaders in Davos.
No, I don't think there is. I mean, right now, there's plenty of money around. The issue is yield. There aren't projects out there where you can really see a return. I don't agree that things are rosy in 2020. You start looking at Boeing and the auto industries, real big entities within the U.S., and they're both doing terribly right now. The investment has been pointed out, has been very, very bad. So there's really no reason. I mean, this is a temporary truce. It is not, to anyone's idea, a complete solution. Phase two is in the offing. Washington wants to press. Beijing is holding back and saying, let's see what happens. So at this point, I think people are still looking at their options, and there's not going to be anybody jumping on the bandwagon. If anything is happening, it's as was seen in England. You see a lot of tech development pouring in, and the money, guess where it's coming from? US and China. Why? Because if you're in England, you can trade with both US and China. People are going to safe havens. They're rerouting the supply chain, but it's not a win-win situation because you're abandoning existing efforts in different areas and having to put new plant in just to keep things going. This is not about expansion.
Antony, one final point. The World Economic Forum, every year they produce what they call the Global Risk Report. They survey something like 750 business leaders in compiling this report. This year, 78% of those business leaders say they expect, quote, economic confrontations and domestic political polarization to rise in 2020. That seems to be a real big vote, no confidence vote, really.
Well, I think we live in a polarized world. We certainly see that in Europe. We see it in the United States. And those are the conditions that create this confrontation and this risk and these geopolitical issues that certainly, to some extent, are not supportive of investment or supportive of faster economic growth. But I never want to underestimate the will of politicians to make compromises when it's politically expedient. Even the phase two trade deal, which people talk about, I would not rule out the possibility that we get it before the presidential election. Remember, there are going to be intense negotiations, and the politicians of both countries, China and the United States, can define what a phase two deal is. So even though today financial markets say it's challenging, they can easily water down what they call a phase two deal and declare victory and get it resolved before the presidential elections if it's politically expedient for both countries.
That's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Before we go, we invite you to listen to the Heat podcast. It's available through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We cover similar stories from around the world, but you get a more personal and candid look with our guests. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.